that utilizes this concept. And yet, as Monica Albrecht points out in a very recent introduction to a volume titled Postcolonialism Cross-Examined, post-Soviet post-colonial studies, and that's the expression she uses, along with even more recent post-Ottoman post-colonial studies, tend to fall on the margins of mainstream post-colonial scholarship focused on Western or European colonialism. The volume edited by Albrecht, published just this year, presents a rare attempt to bring these different multi-directional perspectives together and into a dialogue. There are both similarities and differences between Soviet rule in the Baltics, for example, and the British colonial rule in India. Estonian literary scholar Epp Annus, one of the proponents of Soviet post-colonialism in Estonia and internationally, has defined Soviet post-colonialism as a form of colonialism whereby colonial strategies of subjugation and domination are inseparable from attempts to build a communist society. In her 2018 monograph, Soviet Post-Colonial Studies, A View from the Western Borderlands, Annus proposes a move toward post-colonial Soviet area studies. And the kinds of studies that would include research into the period of Soviet rule in territories under Soviet influence. So it's both the Soviet Union, but also Central Eastern Europe. The focus of her research is on the colonial character of Soviet strategies of domination, their influence on collectivities and individuals alike, and also the processes of decolonization, which in her view began a lot earlier than the Soviet Union collapsed. As Monica Albrecht emphasizes, post-Soviet post-colonial studies are regenerating mainstream post-colonial studies by, among other things, drawing attention to European internal colonialism and its multidirectional character. Moreover, scholars advancing Soviet post-colonialist thinking, and there are also scholars from Latvia and Lithuania and various other countries among them, have problematized the relationship between colonizer and colonized. So according to this new view that they are proposing, and that's being spelled out by Annus among others, colonizer and colonized do not denote objective features of human beings of a particular kind, but rather they indicate structural positions that become activated in certain situations. An immigrant from Soviet Ukraine to Soviet Latvia could adopt or attain the position of the colonizer, but they also could be assigned this particular role from without. However, this was not necessarily a stable position, and it is possible to talk about code switching, activation and deactivation of registers. So the positions of colonized and colonizers are not stable and fixed. This more nuanced thinking about colonizer and colonized could be linked to attempts to make sense of the complexities that characterized the Soviet era and the relationships between the Soviet center and the Baltic states on the periphery of the Soviet Union. The Baltic states were at the time of Soviet takeover capitalist nation states, which is why some scholars have objected to their inclusion in post-colonial scholarship. So you can't be, a country can't be approached through a post-colonial lens if the country was capitalist to begin with. Summarizing arguments pro and con for the use of Soviet post-colonialism in Estonia, Johanna Ross describes initial reluctance by Estonian scholars to think of themselves and their culture in post-colonial terms, to self-identify as colonized. And in Estonian humanities, there's been quite a lot written about it. And about this reluctance to assume this particular position. Even so, partly for a lack of a better term, Soviet postcolonialism has become to be seen as a useful concept that facilitates the translation of local experiences to international audiences and making local experiences understandable to foreign audiences who know little about local history, for example. Moreover, Soviet postcolonialism could be seen as a framework that helps to grasp ambivalent phenomena that escape the binary model of Soviet power versus local resistance that is still prevalent in Estonia and I dare to say not only in Estonia. But Soviet postcolonialism is no antidote to ethnic nationalism. Rather, it can be appropriated for various political and ideological purposes, as demonstrated by Dirk Uffermann, among others, in the same fresh volume edited by Monika Albrecht. Rimas Žilinskas observed back in 2008 in his review of the pioneering 2006 volume Baltic Postcolonialism that was edited by Violeta Kelertas, that contributions to this book were characterized by, and I quote Žilinskas, a nationalist attitude towards Sovietization, and that the contributions attached moral evaluation to the analysis by condemning the Soviet way of life, and that only a small number of the authors discussed the remnants of the colonization mechanism. And another quote from Žilinskas, using Homi Bhabha's terminology, I would encourage giving less thought to mimicry and more to hybridity, which essentially complicates the discussion of the post-colonial individual's identity with oversimplified terms of nationalism, patriotism, and cultural purity. So it makes a difference how we apply Soviet post-colonialism, and it can be applied in various ways and for various purposes. According to Jacques Lacan, the effect of mimicry is camouflage. Homi Bhabha describes mimicry as, and I quote, one of the most elusive and effective strategies of colonial power and knowledge. The discourse of mimicry is constructed around an ambivalence. Colonial mimicry is the desire for a reformed, recognizable other as a subject of difference that is almost the same, but not quite. So there's an ironic compromise. End of quote. Hybridity, on the other hand, draws attention to the interdependence of colonized and colonizer. Their subjectivities are mutually constructed in what Bhabha calls the third space of enunciation. And I quote, "It is only when we understand that all cultural statements and systems are constructed in this contradictory and ambivalent space of enunciation that we begin to understand why hierarchical claims to the inherent originality or purity of cultures are untenable, even before we resort to historical instances that demonstrate their hybridity." End of quote. Now I would like to quote Annus, and I promise there are less quotes in later in the presentation. But Annus writes in her 2018 monograph, in describing the situation in the Baltics after the Soviet invasion, we find a tension, even an incompatibility between the implemented colonial model of subordination and the fact that the subordinated national groups were modern nation states with a developed sense of national identity and cultural self-confidence. Soviet colonial rule in the Baltics, as well as in the Eastern Central Europe, was thus never fully established. Anti-colonial discourses were always present in the Soviet borderland, end of quote. And the same claim of the impossibility of full or complete colonization is repeated elsewhere in the book, at least 5 times in the Estonian language, more elaborated edition that was published last year. Reading this, I am tempted to ask, what would a fully established Soviet colonial rule look like? Was there a part of Soviet Union that was fully colonized? How do we know that the establishment of a foreign colonial rule has been successfully completed? Where there are power, there is resistance, writes Foucault. And yet, or rather consequently, this resistance is never in a position of exteriority in relation to power. If Soviet colonial rule in the Baltics was never fully established, does it follow from this that locals in the Baltics, that would be Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians first and foremost, were somehow immune to the Soviet influences, that they retained their purity and the purity of their culture, which, as we just heard from Homi Baba, is an untenable claim to begin with, because it's always hybrid. And also when we look at folkloristic research on concepts of hybrid and creolization, and the critique that has critical effort that's been put into deconstructing the idea of culture as kind of bounded bubbles that do not mix. Moreover, how does one tell anti-colonial discourses from other kinds of discourses, especially with hindsight, from a temporal and spatial distance? If one is to believe prevalent post-Soviet accounts, then the Communist Party of Estonia and the youth organization Komsomol were in the Soviet times full of dissidents who were undermining the system from within. Along somewhat similar lines, Annus emphasizes the decolonizing potential of family folklore, for example, about the pre-war Republic of Estonia that children heard at homes, or the decolonizing potential of weekends that were spent in the summer cottages or in the countryside in spaces that differed from official Soviet spaces. And she also draws a clear distinction between the Soviet and the national at Baltic song festivals. Reading the monograph by Annus, I found myself asking about the totalitarian regimes and social inequalities of the interwar era in the independent Republic of Estonia, or that of Latvia or Lithuania. And I also found myself asking about locals, Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians who embraced socialism and communism, about Latvians who fought in the Red Army, about the Latvian artist Jakob Spīne, who kept notebooks on historical and philosophical materialism in the 1940s and 50s in an effort to master the Soviet parlance. And I am very happy to be collaborating with a wonderful young Latvian scholar, Digna Udra, who's working on Jakob Spīne. And reading Annus, I also thought about people who proposed that their neighbors ought to be deported as kulaks in Stalinist years. In 1945 and 1946, local representatives of the Communist Party on the tiny Estonian island of Kihnu, which is a destination loved by folklorists past and present, sent to their bosses on the mainland a list of 10 islanders who they claimed ought to be deported. And the response they received from the office, from the party office in Pärnu, was that no inhabitant of Kihnu was prosperous enough to qualify as a kulak. And there were approximately 1,000 people living in Kihnu at the time. Reading Annus, I was also reminded of interviews that I myself conducted a couple of years ago with people who in the Soviet era lived next to a Soviet military airbase and who nowadays are neighbors to a NATO airbase. Local farmers, back in the day in the Soviet era, local farmers would bribe their way to the closed military settlement, the garrison, to sell fresh produce and even to socialize with officers. Back then, it was possible for the local municipality to ask the pilots to change the route that they were using to fly their kind of very noisy military planes, so that they would not fly over the civilian settlement. Negotiations of this kind are impossible with current NATO forces based in Estonia in this particular locality. In the Soviet era, besides a distinction between us and them, there was also a mundane joint space that was built around mutual interests and a sense of neighborliness. Last but not least, reading Annus, I was reminded of a Stalinist youth novel about a young female teacher, and it was a book I loved to read when I was a schoolgirl. And I used to get carried away by the book's didactical plot and the very kind of optimistic ethos. I was born in 1980, so I never got to be a little Octoberist and let alone a young pioneer. However, I was nevertheless susceptible to and immersed in discourses of this kind. The purpose of this and other examples is to suggest that when it comes to Soviet postcolonial studies, there is no one view from the Western borderlands. Alternative examples could be chosen and other arguments used. Moreover, circumstances changed over the many decades of Soviet rule. And this brings me to reflexivity. Perhaps even more so than some other theoretical approaches, Soviet postcolonialism underlines the importance of laying bare how we, researchers, are part of the world we are studying. Without the principles guiding the choices we are making and how we position ourselves vis-a-vis the topic or phenomenon that we are studying. And again, perhaps more so than in case of some other approaches or theoretical frameworks, generation seems to play a role in applications of Soviet postcolonialism. What kinds of first-hand experiences of the regime does one have or lack? Whether one represents a view from the diaspora, what is one's family background, upbringing, and also prior research? The sources and methods that are used. A view based on literary texts, on works of art, and other speech acts that emanate from the elite or intellectuals are bound to differ from a perspective that builds on vernacular culture as it emerges and is lived on a day-to-day basis. As Annus notes in her book as well, everyday life, and I quote, did not consist of impermanent struggle against the Soviet regime, end of quote. Reflexivity, as we all know, includes questions about researchers' own roles, which become entangled with further questions about audiences. If the Soviet postcolonial framework holds the promise of making better sense of the complexities of the Soviet system and era, then it is bound to mean different things depending on target audiences. We frame and order our arguments differently depending on the imagined or real audience. Spending time and space on contextualization means that we have to hurry up once we get to analysis proper, if we ever get there. And I'm sure that's a sense and experience shared by many who study phenomena back home and then are presenting them to international audiences. Explaining things to outsiders with no or little prior background knowledge without compromising on the complexity of the argument is easier said than done. Moreover, as Zhilinskas observed over a decade ago, scrutinizing or even just admitting Soviet influences on one's consciousness does not come easily. A lot is at stake for individuals, collectives, and states alike, given that Estonia, Latvia, and Estonia restored their independence on the basis of legal continuity between pre- and post-Soviet states. Estonia and Latvia only granted citizenship to pre-1940 citizens and their descendants. It could be argued that coming out clean from the Soviet era, so to say, has been an existential matter, a means of saving one's face. However, losing one's face might be a necessary step towards gaining a better understanding of oneself. One of the most revelatory findings for me in studying ethnicity and nationalism in contemporary Estonia has been the extent to which Estonia's approach to cultural diversity and management thereof coincides with Soviet understandings of nations, nationality, and ethnicity. As many scholars have argued, Rogers Brubaker perhaps most vocally and forcefully, the Soviet regime was anti-national and repressed nationalism, while at the same time, and I quote, institutionalizing territorial nationhood and ethnic nationality as fundamental social categories, end of quote. The Soviet Union was an ethno-federal state. It consisted of Union republics and other national territories, each expressly defined as the homeland of and for a particular ethno-national group. At the same time, the state assigned each individual a nationality that was registered in identity documents and in the passport. Based on descent, nationality was an ethnocultural category the individual was born into, and that could not be easily changed or left. Brubaker argues that this double system laid the foundation for later independent statehood of Soviet republics, as well as, and I quote, for their self-understanding as specifically national state, end of quote. In the case of Baltic states, these foundations had been laid much earlier, and the Soviet regime sought to knock them down by various repressive means. Another scholar, Ilya Gorenburg, has criticized approaches, and these tend to be approaches by Western scholars, that overemphasize the strengthening impact of Soviet policies on non-Russian ethnic identities. According to Gorenburg, the tension between identity promotion and assimilation was an inherent part of Soviet nationality policy throughout the Soviet Union's existence. Union republics and their titular nationalities, like Estonians in Estonia, could enjoy the most extensive network of ethnic institutions, which included native language universities, research institute, including folklore archives. However counterintuitive it might seem, the Soviet regime also fostered the idea of Estonia as a country of and for the Estonian nation, understood in essentialist and ethnic terms. Based on my research, I would argue that Estonians, Soviet-era newcomers to Estonia, and their descendants in contemporary Estonia tend to share an understanding of nationality as ethnicity, and it's a category one is born into. This concept of inherited personal nationality that was institutionalized by the Soviet system of passport nationality constitutes an implicit shared ground, a commonality that is shared by most permanent residents of Estonia. There appears to be a consensus that all individuals can be pinned down as something or somebody in ethnic and national terms, at least when there is a need for such a definition. This particular understanding of ethnic nationality provides a rationale behind post-Soviet Estonia's self-representation as a home for 100 or close to 200 nationalities. It is worth bearing in mind when reading this explanation on the website of the Estonian Ministry of Culture that Estonia's overall population is a little over 1.3 million. Thus, 2% Ukrainians amounts to approximately 25,000 individuals. The number of individuals representing the remaining 189 ethnic nationalities not mentioned on this website is really tiny, really minuscule. However, it is important from a symbolic and political point of view. To my eye, it points to continuities between Soviet and post-Soviet approaches to ethnicity and nationality, or at least to a good fit between the Soviet concepts and efforts of post-Soviet Estonia to make sense of and organize and manage diversity within its bounds. The approach represented by Brubaker might give us mental space to reformulate questions that folklorists have been asking about the history of their discipline. For example, instead of, or in addition to asking whether runasong or regilaul, which is traditional kind of classically 8-syllable singing style in the Baltic Finnic realm, maintained its status as a national symbol during the Soviet era. And this whether question is one posed by the Estonian Liina Saarlo in her very thorough and interesting study of this question. So instead of asking whether runasong maintained its status as a national symbol, we could inquire how the Soviet system and ideology facilitated and shaped the status of runasong as a national symbol. And what did national stand for under these particular circumstances? Moreover, how did the Soviet context and circumstances influence approaches to the study of runasongs, interactions between scholars and singers, or correspondence and other collaborators of folklore archives? The Song and Dance Festival could be approached as part and parcel of Soviet policies. Instead of treating the Soviet and the national as mutually exclusive categories, we could ask how they fed on each other. As I have argued elsewhere, this relationship and how it changed over the years could be analyzed by looking at the relationship between form and content. By controlling forms, one can modify contents and ultimately change the reality, if only temporarily. National/Estonian form outlived the socialist/Soviet form. Now I got the form and content mixed up myself. Okay, I'll try again. National/Estonian form outlived the socialist/Soviet content, but the distinction between the two became rather blurred in the period of late socialism. There is a quote by Michael Herzfeld that sums up these dynamics and that I really, really like. And it goes as follows. The more fixed the semiotic form, the greater is the play of ambiguity and the more surprising are the possibilities for violating the code itself. Folklore is about form and content, and folklorists have shown in numerous insightful studies how Soviet authorities commissioned folklore collections that would have the correct political and ideological content in a recognizably traditional form. Shifts that happen over time and from bottom up are harder to discern and identify. Giving up either or, us versus them setups that are ultimately built on the idea of resistance and dissent might empower us to ask questions of new kinds. If the framework of Soviet postcolonialism causes a sense of reluctance, and one is not willing to position oneself as colonized or as colonizer, we could look at other contemporary approaches that are aimed at making sense of diversity, such as notions of belonging and conviviality, and both come from attempts to make sense of diversity and living with diversity in very, very diverse urban contexts. But I think it might be interesting to consider how they could be applied to other contexts that are characterized by similar tensions, like the Soviet context. In their own ways, both belonging and conviviality are focused on modes and practices of coexistence as this coexistence emerges under particular circumstances. My subjective impression is that case studies, analysis of particular phenomena, analysis of a person, his or her life and deeds, studies of a particular issue, yield richer insights that lay bare the contradictions and circumstances that characterized the Soviet system and the period of its domination over much of Central Eastern Europe. Such in-depth case studies might serve as a necessary step that paves the way for comparative studies that would throw light on post-war disciplinary history of folkloristics and related disciplines in the former Soviet Union and the Socialist bloc. While some scholars have questioned the idea that the Soviet Union ever had a coherent and systematic nationality policy, it was nominally an ethno-federal state, and it operated within its bounds with particular ideas about links between ethnicity, nationality, territory, and rights. It shaped the lands and peoples within its bounds in more direct and diverse ways than it did the countries in Central and Eastern Europe and the inhabitants of these countries. Differences of this kind appear to be significant and worth holding on to, at least until we have a better sense of what happened on the ground, in particular research institutes, archives in the working lives of individual folklorists, their correspondents and bosses. Socialist is a much broader and consequently vaguer concept than Soviet. Socialism meant and means different things for different people. It is contemporaneous with us in ways that Soviet is not. About a decade ago, along with some colleagues, we initiated the Socialist and Post-Socialist Area Studies section of the American Folklore Society. Though our interest in setting up such a section emerged from research focused on the former Soviet Union, we were and have been acutely aware of the fact that there are many socialist states out there today. And moreover, socialism needn't be defined in geographical terms. It is a doctrine that by definition is not tied to a specific ideology, nor is it incompatible with democracy. Talking about Soviet folkloristics instead of socialist folkloristics might seem too limiting at the first sight. At the same time, it might help us to move towards greater conceptual clarity and ultimately towards a better understanding of what the Soviet Union and its particular version of socialism was about. How the Soviet version of socialism differed from socialism practice elsewhere, and what did it mean for scholars of folklore and folk culture more broadly. What was folkloristics alike, and how did folklore studies in the Baltics, which in itself is not a homogeneous region, differed from folkloristics in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and in the German Democratic Republic? How they were similar, if not the same. Presentations today and tomorrow are bound to broaden and diversify our thinking about these matters in valuable ways. Personally, I would be hesitant to assemble these insights under the rubric of disciplinary heritage. Some folklorists are close to allergic to the term heritage, and I happen to be one of them, even though I'm fully aware of its multiple meanings and various uses and the popular appeal of the concept heritage. But whenever I hear the term heritage, it is hard for me not to be reminded of what I keep telling my students. Heritage is selective. It is bound to change what it seeks or claims to preserve. It is about adding value. It is about change. We write the history of folklore studies as we study its past and the past and the pasts of neighboring fields. We write the history of folklore studies as we choose our research topic that focus on the present day. Our choices make a difference, and sometimes these choices are tough, because folklore studies are hardly ever about folklore alone. Folklore is not about folklore alone. It's inseparable from the surrounding world. It's a means of creating this world and responding to it. Our choices are also about us, about people embedded in complex networks of human relations, about individual lives and ambitions that are led under political circumstances that are never fully of anyone's own making. The best we can do, perhaps, is to take this complexity in earnest, weigh carefully the information we have access to, and try to listen to silences that are always there, asking ourselves why they are there and what to do about them. And also while staying aware of the silences that we ourselves are producing through our choices.